One man would be abducted by a strange craft right in front of his friend's eyes. He would be shown images of humanity's future and told to spread messages to save lives. Not too long later, he would be told to come meet with them again, this time bringing his wife along. After going through hypnotic regression, he would share many details that he didn't remember before. In this video, let's take a look into how this encounter first started and where it left off. This story begins with a man named Filiberto Cárdenas, who immigrated to Florida just a bit after the Cuban Revolution. He would come to live in the small town of Haley, Florida, a suburb area just short ways away from Miami. Sometime later on, he would meet his wife Iris, and the two would have 4 children together. Filiberto also owned and ran a small gift shop called Zarabanda, which was on 4150 East 4th Avenue, where he and his wife worked for many years. On Thursday, January 27th, 1979, Filiberto Cárdenas would be working at this very gift shop. This is when he would receive a call from one of his friends, Fernando Martí. Fernando wanted to go out and buy a pig so they could all roast it up that weekend. Filiberto would agree to this and waited for his friend to arrive. Fernando soon showed up around 6 p.m. with his wife Myrta and daughter Isabel with him. Feeling a bit tired, Filiberto gave Fernando the keys to his 1970 station wagon and hopped into the passenger seat to rest. Driving along US Route 267, they stopped at 2 different farms but couldn't find a pig to buy. Not wanting to give up just yet, they drove down a small side road toward the 3rd farm. After a little ways, their car started to lose power and the engine died out of nowhere. Fernando tried to start it again, but couldn't get the car to respond in the slightest. The 2 men simply looked at each other with concern before popping the hood open and getting out of the car. Fernando opened the hood and they both looked around to see if they could figure out what was wrong. Filiberto began to mess with the battery cables to see if they had come loose, but found them still firmly attached. Fernando then went back to try to start the car, but nothing happened. The headlights wouldn't even come on. He got back out of the car and started examining the steering column, thinking that there had to be wire problems there. He followed the wires under the hood and was trying to look behind everything, practically laying on top of the still-hot engine. Both of the men soon noticed a violet and red light, flashing in sequence, reflecting off of the metal on the engine. At the same time, the entire group began to hear a strange buzzing sound, later described as sounding like a large swarm of bees. The light grew more intense and the sound became louder before the whole car began to shake. Myrta, who was still in the back seat, began to panic as her daughter sat next to her. Apparently, the family had just moved from California to Florida because of a bad earthquake, and she thought she was experiencing this same thing again. She covered her daughter with her body to protect her, all while screaming in terror. When Filiberto heard the screaming, he immediately tried to go and see what was wrong, but he felt completely paralyzed. Fernando, who was still on his stomach under the hood, felt his feet begin to be pulled upwards. He tried to crawl further under, but found that he could no longer move either. Filiberto felt that the same force that paralyzed him was now raising him into the air. He later said, "I tried to move, but I was paralyzed in position, unable to do anything, even unable to move my arms. I could hear the screams of the women in the car. I looked down and saw that I was suspended in the air and rising. When I was 8 to 10 feet above the car, everything went dark, and I don't remember what happened." Fernando looked up as this was happening, seeing Filiberto in a bluish-white beam, shouting, "Let me go! Let me go!" before disappearing into a dark elliptical object. This bulky object ascended and floated away, then soon after flew off to the west. Then the lights and sound all ceased at once. Fernando soon realized that he was able to move again and rushed to his wife and daughter. He yelled at them, "They have taken Filiberto! Mama, they have taken Filiberto!" After seeing that the 2 were fine, he hopped back into the driver's seat and turned the keys. After several attempts, the car finally started, but it seemed to be running very poorly. He said it almost felt as if it were out of gasoline. They soon drove back to the highway, with Fernando unsure of what to do next. He was worried that if he reported this to the police, they may not believe him and think that he was what caused Filiberto to go missing. But with no other options, he stopped at a service station on 29th Street and called the police. Right after this, he called Miss Cárdenas, telling her, "A light took Filiberto away." She asked for more details, but Fernando couldn't seem to find a way to explain it, saying that he didn't understand it himself. Iris began to cry as she hung up the phone and called the police herself. When she heard that they had no additional information, she called her nephew out to ask him to bring him to where Filiberto had last been seen. They looked around for a while but never did find anything. At this point, Fernando had met up with some police and they had followed him out to where the encounter had taken place. They too looked around but didn't immediately find anything. Since it was already dark out, the police decided to go ahead and contact nearby Homestead Air Base, and they sent out a helicopter with some spotlights. Around this time, Filiberto suddenly became aware of the sound of tire on pavement and a couple of loud cats. He followed the noise and soon found himself in the middle of a highway. A driver was forced to stomp on his brakes to avoid hitting him. He was able to tell that something wasn't quite right and he got out to pull Filiberto to the side of the road. He then called the police. Filiberto later said, "The next thing I remember is waking up to consciousness on my hands and knees, and two bright lights rushing at me. I heard brakes screeching and tires skid, and the lights swerved and came to a stop. I was helped from the road by a man taking my collar and leading me off the road. I learned later that this was near 137th Avenue on the Miami Trail, some 12 miles from where my car stalled." The first officer, Patrolman William Christian, arrived at about 8:15. From his first impression, he thought he was dealing with either a drunk or a man that had been beaten and left on the side of the road. He then asked Filiberto what had happened, but he only told him that he had no idea. Later, Filiberto would say that he didn't elaborate anymore at that moment because he was afraid people would think he was crazy. A second officer soon arrived and they began to ask him some more questions, but it seems that Filiberto's English wasn't that great, so they ended up searching him for identification. They found his wallet, and it didn't take them too long to find out that he was the missing person everyone was looking for. They radioed in the situation to the other officers, and then took him down to the station. On the way there, Filiberto slowly started to recover and come back to his senses. He tried to explain to the officers what had happened to him. Officer Christian seemed to feel that something strange and unusual did indeed happen to the man. On his official report, under type of offense, he even wrote, "Close encounter of the third kind." The other officers called off the search, and the whole group, Miss Cárdenas, her nephew, Fernando and his family, all followed them back to the station. Upon arrival, they would come to see Filiberto in a much worse condition than he was just 3 hours beforehand. His wife was very concerned after seeing him this way and insisted on taking him to the clinic right away. Soon Filiberto would be treated, having numerous skin abrasions, lesions, and systematic dysfunctions. He would also complain of pain in both of his knees and blurry, out-of-focus vision. They examined him and gave him a few x-rays, but they didn't find anything major wrong with him. The hospital would note that he had stable vital signs, a small abrasion on his forehead, and a small yellow lesion on his right shoulder. They would say that altogether there were 108 marks all over his body, with some comparing many of the wounds to acupuncture marks. One doctor ended up thinking that it could be negative effects from radiation exposure, but they didn't have the equipment to test for that at this small clinic. The next day, early in the morning, he was taken to Jackson Memorial Hospital in Miami. Unfortunately, they didn't have the equipment to test for that either, so they would end up also contacting Homestead Air Force Base. Some of the airbase personnel then came out to the hospital to examine Filiberto, but they said that their results for radiation were negative. They would also tell him that there had been no unusual air activity observed by radar the night before. He was soon released from the hospital and went back home. Not long after, he began to experience other symptoms as well. Over the course of just one day, he would complain of eye irritation and sensitivity, excessive thirst, profuse sweating, a sulfur-like body odor, hot and cold flashes, and memory lapses. At one point, he even claimed that his urine was a dark yellow-brown color. This same day, Filiberto would be contacted by attorney and local UFO researcher, Virgilio Sanchez. Dr. Sanchez had already been working on a number of other UFO cases this time, and had a whole team working with him. This team included engineers, doctors, a psychologist, a neurologist, and a professional hypnotist. The whole team would come out to question Filiberto while performing medical, psychological, and neurological examinations. At one point, he even got Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who used to work for Project Blue Book, to come out and help advise them on their research. Soon after, Sanchez would arrange for a hypnotherapist and an expert on the subject of alien encounters to conduct regressions on Cárdenas. This was said to be a local hypnotherapist who claimed to have no opinions on UFOs. He also happened to speak Spanish, making the questioning much easier. The first of 4 sessions would begin on January 27th, and this is where Filiberto, as well as the others, would discover the details of his abduction. After being paralyzed and knocked out by the strange light and sound, Filiberto woke up. He then realized he still couldn't move, seeming to be in some kind of chair that suctioned him down into it and restricted his movements. Looking around the small room, he came to see 3 strange figures standing on one side of him. One of them then approached Filiberto and placed some kind of helmet on his head. His helmet seemed to be full of small needles, and some of them fell all the way to his shoulders. They then tried to communicate with him, but they seemed to be speaking a different language. He thought that it may have been German. He gestured to them that he didn't understand. The figure speaking then began to rotate a button on his chest, before suddenly speaking English. Filiberto indicated that he still couldn't understand him, so they again rotated the button. This time they were speaking Spanish, although it was with more of a South American accent. After performing their examination on him, they would take him into another room. There he met with a 4th entity. This time, though, it was wearing a cape and sitting on a high throne-like chair. He would then speak to Cárdenas in both vocal speech and telepathy in perfect Spanish. On the walls, they projected images, which he said almost looked like TV or film, but not quite. They seemed to show scenes from humanity's past and future. He was soon led into another room, which was very similar to the first. He was then placed back into one of the suction seats. He could now see out of a window. He realized that he was in a smaller ship as it discharged away from what he called the mothership. They flew for only a moment before an unfamiliar narrow sandy beach and gray ocean were visible. As the ship came lower to the ground, he noticed red, brown, and purple rocks rising steeply away from this beach. The craft began to hover just a few feet off the ground, with one of the entities getting out and shining a light onto the rocks. Suddenly, the rocks began to part, with a large tunnel or cavern now being visible. More ships suddenly shot out of the opening and flew over the sea. Then they all began to abruptly tilt downwards and descend into the ocean itself. The ship Filiberto was in started to do the same, moving at such an incredible speed he couldn't make out what was happening outside. As they dove into the water, he noticed that it didn't quite come into contact with the ship and was separated by a barrier of air. They started to slow down, and he could now see that they appeared to be in a large underwater tunnel. The walls were translucent and seemed to glow. He described them as looking like they were made of solidified water. The craft then emerged into what looked to be a very large and completely dry cavern, but Filiberto couldn't see any stalagmites or anything like that. Very quickly, he came to see 2 large symbols made of stone, and these impressed him, with him comparing the size of them to a telephone pole. The first looked to be a serpent and was quite large. The second one was similar, but smaller, and he couldn't tell what it was for sure. Filiberto and his strange guides then got off the ship, with them leading him over to a rock where they would let him sit around for a moment. Soon an enormous door would open, with several more entities emerging. In this moment, the sensations he was feeling were strange, and it was all overwhelming for Filiberto. There was an unfamiliar odor in the air that made him feel like he couldn't breathe, with a strange pressure on his chest. One of these figures would walk over to him, loudly telling him, "Welcome!" To him, this seemed to be an Earth person, and he began to speak with Filiberto in Spanish. And he too seemed to have a South American accent. This person told him that he was from Earth like him, and had been working with the entities for some time now. He also told Filiberto that he should be happy because he would be receiving instructions from other human beings that were working with them. He was then led to another doorway which opened onto a street in what looked to be a small city. They would cross the street and take him into a building where he would be stripped and placed against the wall. This wall suctioned him down and restricted his movements just as the chairs had done earlier. The panel he was against then rotated off the wall and moved him into a horizontal position. And at this time, while Filiberto was still under hypnosis, it's said that he became quite agitated. He would say that the entities were passing a device over him and trying to explain what they were doing to him. But in reality, he just feels threatened and afraid of these strange instruments. The entities themselves also seemed off to Filiberto. He felt like they were hiding their true appearance, and they looked almost like a doll to him. Mechanical arms full of instruments then emerged from the walls and moved over to Filiberto, as it seemed to test different parts of his body. Suction cups were placed all over him, almost completely covering his skin. He didn't feel any pain at this point, but he still couldn't move either. Lights were shined into his eyes and his ears and along other parts of his body. He even claims that they took a semen sample from him. At this point, he became pretty impatient and wanted to know when they would be done with him. and just a couple moments later the test seemed to be finished, so they let him up and gestured for him to get dressed. Then they began to project more images all around the room. They seemed similar to the ones he saw earlier, with them showing him future events around the world. He saw boats, airplanes, and mountains at first, but then he saw images of China, with the beings telling him that they are in control over the country. They say that something good will happen there soon. He's then shown images of pyramids and obelisks in various locations, with one in the Atlantic, another in the Pacific, and one deep within the Earth itself. He is told that many of these places are inhabited by entities and humans like them. Another image shows 3 of these pyramids connected by light, with him being told that they are, quote, controls that we have here in the Earth. They then make him lay down and go to sleep, before waking him up a short time later. They would give him something to eat, which reminded him of pills. At this point, Filiberto said he felt like they were going to drive him crazy. He was then taken into another, larger room where a craft of some kind sat in a vertical position. Filiberto said that this visually reminded him of a rocket on a launch pad. They went inside this craft, where he met 3 more of these strange entities. One placed him down into a suction seat as they did before, and the other seemed to be manipulating some controls. The ship departed at such a speed that he again couldn't make out anything through the window. Before he knew it, the door to the craft was opening up once again, and he was freed from the seat. He was led outside into a pasture where another entity would open his mouth and make him drink some kind of liquid. The entities got back inside the craft with the door closing behind him. It then took off into the sky with it going out of sight fairly quickly. At this point, Filiberto started to feel sick. It took a great amount of effort to keep himself upright and orientated. He wasn't sure where he was, and he wasn't completely aware of his surroundings. He could hear some cats yelling in the distance and saw some kind of light, so he began to walk towards them. And this is when he would be found in the middle of the highway by the passing motorist. After this, he claims that he could still hear the aliens' voices in his head on occasions, and felt like these were remotely sent messages. He claims that at some point during the examination he was subjected to, a small device was implanted behind each ear. This allowed him to receive messages, as well as see and hear 3D projected scenes from around the planet. He said that while watching these 3D projected screens, he could even feel the temperature difference as well as smell the air there. It felt nearly real to him, as if he was transported there himself. After hearing this, Dr. Hypnotic would suggest that this could be an advanced technology affecting him on a cellular level. Sometimes, when Filiberto would see these messages, he would feel like he was no longer on Earth and actually in space somewhere. He believes that he was being tested as a messenger meant to warn humanity of future catastrophes, adding that he was only one of many that were being contacted by these aliens. As an example, he would tell the hypnotherapist that in the near future, many cities will disappear under the ocean in a very short amount of time. He says that the aliens want to help prevent some of these disasters in hopes of saving lives. The hypnotherapist would then ask him to identify the most important things he had been told about. Filiberto first talks about a failed conference between 3 parties, which he thought involved the Middle East, and he was told that this could lead to a great war. He would also mention that after 1985, several dictatorships in Latin American countries and the Philippines would fall. He would also be told that Mexico City would be destroyed, and at some point California would sink into the ocean. Filiberto did ask the aliens if there was any way to prevent these tragedies, but he was simply told no. They said that the only thing they could do was get people to leave the areas. He then asked them if this was all punishment for something that humans had done. But the entities emphasized that they were not the ones causing these events. They said that these were natural disasters and nothing could be done to change what will happen. At one point during the hypnosis session, Filiberto even said, "I was told that I was going to travel to Europe to give some important messages to the Pope." Around this time, his friends and family would say that for about 5 minutes a night, he would say meaningless words and numbers. Filiberto now claimed that he was becoming more telepathically sensitive towards others as well. One day, he even drove out to help his father-in-law, whose car had broke down, without even being contacted. Then, over the next couple weeks, he would return to the site of the abduction. Every time he did so, his watch would start to run rapidly, so fast it audibly made a whirring sound. He would even demonstrate this to his wife, friends, and even Dr. Sanchez before taking the watch in for repairs. On February 21st, 1979, Filiberto would receive another message, this time asking him to return to the abduction site. And now he would ask if it was okay to bring his wife, Iris, along with him. They told him that since the two were a unity, she was considered one with him and therefore could accompany him. So at 4 in the morning, Mr. and Mrs. Cárdenas went to wait at that side road off of the highway. Soon, a top or mushroom-shaped UFO flew up to them. It hovered next to their parked car, almost in the same spot it had been in during their first encounter. It was nearly the size of a railroad car and was a dull silver color all over. It didn't quite touch down to the ground, floating just a few feet above it. It was then that a row of blue, violet, silver, and white blinking lights appeared on both the top of the mushroom shape and at the bottom, which Filiberto would call the gondola. The couple walked up to what looked to be a glass window, but found that they were able to walk straight through it and into the ship. There they saw several narrow swivel chairs with tall backs and sat down. The two turned their chairs around and came to see the occupants, which looked almost, but not quite human. They were about 3.5 to 4 feet tall, and they all wore a tight-fitting, silvery bluish-white one-piece suit. Filiberto would now remember this from his first encounter as well. They had big, elongated eyes, and they reminded him of people from Asia. Their nose looked straight and fairly normal, but their mouth was small and would never move. The entities did converse with one another, but their language sounded almost Arabic to him. When they spoke directly to him, they did so telepathically and in Spanish. Iris said she had to pinch herself to make sure she wasn't dreaming. She then looked a little more closely at the suits they were wearing and even asked one of the aliens if she could touch it. It seems that they agreed to this, so she went up and touched the chest. The material was strange, rough in one direction but smooth in the other, reminding her of fish scales. She would also add that the entity's body felt firm underneath. Iris kept observing more, saying, on the suit, on the right breast, they had an emblem made up of a serpent in the form of an S, or maybe more like a Z, with rounded corners, with a wide X-shaped cross laying down underneath. She would also notice 5 thin cables that ran from the waistline up to the neck before going inside of the suit. She didn't know what these cables were for, but could tell that they didn't impede their movements at all. Iris then backed away and lit up a cigarette. She asked them if they had anything to do with the 2 little girls that had been abducted in Puerto Rico, a story that she had heard from one of the men researching her husband. A few of the aliens then appeared to go into sneezing fits, with Filiberto telling her to put out the cigarette, saying that she should not smoke, saying so that it does not contaminate the atmosphere inside the ship. They then went on to answer her question, telling her that they do not abduct young girls. This relieved Iris, as the two had a 3-year-old daughter back home. The entities then approached them and led them into another room. Iris says that at this time they noticed her painted nails and seemed fascinated by them. This other room looked to be the control room for the ship. One wall was covered in illuminated buttons, while the other had 3D TV-like screens covering it. They showed scenes from future events, much like Filiberto had seen before. They were then told that they were being shown these so they could get people to believe them and accept their messages. This was a message of universal love, and they wanted humans to help each other in times of need. They were soon flown back to their car and sent out of the ship. When they got in the car, they would notice that it was now 5:15 in the morning. They had been in the ship for over an hour at that point. When they got home 15 minutes later, Filiberto almost immediately called Dr. Sanchez. He would tell Dr. Sanchez that he had a second encounter, but wouldn't be able to share the details until after 10 a.m. that morning, although he wasn't sure why. So the two scheduled another call for later. Then, just before 10 a.m., Dr. Sanchez would receive a call from Miami International Airport. Several employees were witnessing a large mothership-like craft with 2 smaller ships circling around it. A Miss Julia Gonzalez and a Mr. Ricardo Sanchez were working in the center of the runway. This is where they were able to clearly observe all 3 craft for several minutes. They would call a local radio station to report it, but they were instead referred to Dr. Sanchez. After interviewing 3 or 4 more employees, he would end up with a pretty good idea of how the ships looked. The mothership was fixed in the sky, it was a round shape, and had 3 bright lights emanating from it. One static white light in the center, with one side having a yellow and the other side having a silver light that both pulsated. The other ships were very similar, but much smaller. One of the employees would say, "We watched them for 20 to 30 minutes. We got tired of looking at them." Sanchez would then finally talk to Filiberto again, who had not even heard of this new sighting. After hearing his story, he would discover that the UFO sighted at the airport would have been directly above where claimed to have been abducted. He believes that the airport witnesses made the Cárdenas case much more credible. What he thought was most amazing was the fact that they could both remember the second encounter without the need for hypnotic regression. Dr. Sanchez, who worked on this case from 1979 until 1982, said, "We studied an abduction case which required a staggering amount of work to complete. After careful review, we were convinced that a UFO contact and abduction had taken place." After this investigation, several more years would pass without much else happening. On December 6, 1985, Filiberto would claim to have been abducted a third time, and again taken under the sea. Dr. Sanchez would decide to do another hypnotic regression on him, although this time would be with a different team. Commenting on this regression, he would say, "We took this opportunity to scan back and forward to the first abduction, and the result was astonishing. It was like renting the same video movie 6 years later, and playing it back and forward trying to find a gap." Then Filiberto's final encounter would happen in 1989. However, this experience would be quite a bit different than the rest. While detailing this abduction, he said, "I was taken to a place at the bottom of the sea, where I felt a very large pressure on my chest. I couldn't breathe, as if it were at a very large depth. Then we went through some passageways, and, in the end, I saw people like me, humans, earthlings." Filiberto added that at this moment he felt a gaze upon him and heard a voice like thunder that told him that his, quote, "predetermined moment has to make its appearance among us." Filiberto didn't really know what this meant exactly and wouldn't come in contact with them again after this encounter. Now that life was back to normal, he actually decided to sell his small gift shop. It hadn't been making that much money, so he decided to invest in a car service station instead. It didn't take him too long to make this into a successful business, but him and his wife were constantly working, often there even on the weekends. And during this time, he never did quit thinking about the encounters he had had all those years ago. Filiberto desperately wanted to share his experience with others and wanted to hear their stories as well. So one year, on his birthday, he decided to sell the service station. He soon began to make plans to visit UFO conferences and investigators all over the country. Dr. Sanchez would write that Filiberto was always viewed as an honest and hard-working man, as well as a determined husband and father, also adding, he was not particularly interested in UFO phenomenon until this chain of events came about. In a later interview, his old friend Fernando would think back on the first encounter, saying, "I would find it hard to believe if I read about it in a newspaper, but I was there with my wife and daughter. We were all terrified by the light and noise. When it ended, Filiberto had vanished." This case is now known to many as the most famous alien abduction in Miami's history. Many others would say that this incident is so important because he was able to bring his wife along for one of the encounters. In one late interview, Filiberto would say, "Before this happened, I scoffed at UFOs. Now I know differently." Thanks again for watching, everyone. Please leave a like and subscribe if you enjoy this type of content. Be sure to leave a comment too. I'm always interested in hearing what you guys think about these cases as well. When dealing with hypnotic regression, I almost immediately think of the Betty and Barney Hill case. And I did make a video on that earlier on if anybody still wants more to watch. And I'll also mention that this is available in podcast form as well, and that's available on most platforms. So if you'd rather hear this instead of watch it, go ahead and give that a shot. For any of you wanting to show your support, I do have a Patreon and a channel membership available where you can get videos early and ad-free. Thanks for being here with me today. This was Matt, and I want to believe.